When rival gangs invaded, the Black Maid showed combat skills that shocked the Mafia boss. The ones who clean up after you are the ones who know where you bury things. The Mancini estate sat on 17 acres of manicured silence, the kind of quiet that money buys and fear maintains. From the road, you could see the iron gates, the stone lions with their frozen snarls, and beyond them, a house that looked less like a home and more like a monument to something better left unnamed. The gravel drive wound through imported Italian cypress trees, past a fountain that had been dry for 3 years because no one remembered to call the maintenance company, and up to a portico designed to make visitors feel small before they had even knocked on the door. Every morning at 6, before the sun had fully committed to the sky, a woman named Grace Mitchell walked through the service entrance carrying nothing but a canvas bag and 32 years of carefully cultivated invisibility. She moved through the house like she'd been born there, which in a way she had. The Grace who existed before this place had died somewhere along the way, replaced by this version who knew exactly which floorboards creaked and which silences meant danger. She had been with the Mancinis for 9 years. 9 years of pressing shirts that cost more than her monthly rent. 9 years of polishing silver that had witnessed conversations she pretended not to hear. 9 years of being the ghost that kept the machine running while the family pretended she didn't exist. That was the arrangement, unspoken but ironclad. Grace saw everything and nothing, heard everything and nothing, and in exchange, she received a paycheck that arrived like clockwork and a studied indifference that passed for respect in certain circles. Vincent Mancini, the patriarch, was a man who had learned to smile without moving his eyes. At 62, he still possessed the physical presence that had built his empire. Broad shoulders, hands that looked like they could crush walnuts, a voice that filled any room it entered without ever seeming to raise. He ran his operations from a study lined with first editions he'd never read, making phone calls that rearranged lives the way other men rearranged furniture. Grace had watched him for 9 years and still couldn't predict which version of him would appear on any given day. The charming businessman who donated to children's hospitals, or the other one, the one whose eyes went flat like a shark's when someone disappointed him. His wife, Elena, existed in a perpetual state of medicated calm, her days measured in pills and appointments with specialists who specialized in finding nothing wrong. She had been beautiful once, and traces of it remained. High cheekbones, elegant hands, the posture of someone who'd been told to stand up straight so often it had become reflex. But the beauty had curdled into something brittle, a porcelain facade that looked like it might shatter if anyone spoke too loudly. She spent her mornings in the garden, her afternoons in her room, and her evenings in the same chair by the window, watching the grounds as if waiting for someone who was never going to arrive. Their son, Marco, was 26 and already wearing the weight of an inheritance that came with conditions he was only beginning to understand. He had his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, a combination that should have been handsome, but instead looked conflicted, like his face couldn't decide which parent to resemble. Grace had watched him grow from a sullen teenager into a sullen adult, and she'd watched something else too. The way he flinched when his father raised his voice, the way he counted drinks at dinner parties, the way he sometimes stood at the edge of conversations like a man waiting for a bus he hoped would never come. Grace knew all of this. She knew the rhythm of the house the way a musician knows their instrument, which doors stuck, which windows rattled in the wind, which silences meant anger, and which meant something worse. She knew that Vincent took his coffee at 7:15, black with exactly 1 sugar, and that he'd throw the cup against the wall if the temperature wasn't right. She knew that Elena cried in the bathroom every Tuesday afternoon, muffling the sound with running water that she let run for exactly 23 minutes. She knew that Marco sometimes sat in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, staring at nothing, and that he'd started doing this more often since his father began, including him in certain meetings that left him looking like someone had hollowed him out from the inside. What they didn't know about Grace could have filled the library they never used. They didn't know about Fort Bragg, about the years she'd spent learning to become something the world had decided a woman like her couldn't be. They didn't know about the operations in places whose names still appeared in her dreams. Fallujah, Mosul, Kandahar, and others that would never appear on any official record. They didn't know about the skills she'd acquired in the service of a country that had used her, and then suggested she find something quieter to do with her remaining years. They saw a 53-year-old black woman with gray threading through her close-cropped hair, comfortable shoes, and the kind of patient expression that people mistake for simplicity. They saw exactly what they expected to see, nothing. That morning, as Grace moved through her routine, starting the coffee, laying out the newspapers in order of importance, checking that the flowers in the foyer hadn't begun to wilt, she felt the air in the house shift. It was subtle, The kind of change that most people would attribute to weather or imagination, like the drop in pressure before a storm that hasn't yet appeared on any radar. But Grace had spent too many years in places where ignoring such shifts got people killed. Her body knew things her mind hadn't caught up to yet. Something was wrong. Something was coming. She found the first sign in the study. A desk drawer left slightly open, papers disturbed in ways that suggested urgency rather than carelessness. Vincent never left things like this. His control extended to every aspect of his environment, a compulsion that bordered on religious. Grace had once watched him spend 15 minutes adjusting a picture frame until it hung at precisely the angle he wanted. She closed the drawer without touching anything else, filing the information away with the thousands of other observations that comprised her internal map of this family and its secrets. By 10 o'clock, the house had filled with its usual population of assistants, advisors, and men whose job titles were deliberately vague. They wore expensive suits and careful expressions, speaking in low voices about matters they assumed she couldn't understand. Grace moved among them like water, refreshing glasses, collecting plates, being everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. She overheard fragments of conversation, Caruso, Borders, Tuesday. But she'd learned long ago that hearing something and understanding it were entirely different skills. Context was everything, and context took time. It was Marco who confirmed her instincts. She found him in the kitchen again, earlier than usual, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. The coffee had gone cold, she could tell by the lack of steam, which meant he'd been sitting there for at least 30 minutes, possibly more. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment, the mask slipped. She saw fear there, raw and unprocessed. The fear of a young man who was beginning to realize that the life he'd been born into came with costs he hadn't anticipated and couldn't refuse. "Grace," he said, her name sounding strange in his mouth. In 9 years, she could count on one hand the times he'd addressed her directly. "Do you ever think about leaving?" She set down the tray she was carrying, giving the question the weight it deserved. A lesser woman might have deflected, played dumb, maintained the pretense that separated their worlds. But something in his voice, some echo of desperation that she recognized from her own past, made her answer honestly. "Every day, Mr. Marco, but thinking and doing are different things." He nodded, as if she'd confirmed something he already knew. His fingers tightened around the cold cup, knuckles whitening. "If something happens," he started, then stopped, shaking his head. "Never mind. Forget I said anything." But Grace didn't forget. She couldn't afford to. That night, long after the house had settled into its expensive silence, she sat in her small room above the garage and cleaned her service weapon for the first time in 3 years. The ritual was familiar, meditative. Oil and cloth, and the precise mechanics of something designed for a single, brutal purpose. The smell of gun oil brought back memories she'd spent years trying to bury. The weight of a rifle in her hands, the sound of her own breathing in her ears, the particular calm that settled over her in moments when most people would be screaming. She hadn't carried the weapon in years, had told herself she'd left that life behind. But some things, once learned, never fully leave. They just wait, patient as stones, for the moment when they become necessary again. The truth doesn't break people. The pretending does. And in this house, everyone was pretending something. Vincent pretended he was legitimate, a businessman whose wealth came from real estate and import-export, not from the broken bones and buried bodies that had built his empire. Elena pretended she didn't know what her husband really did, that the money paying for her pills and her garden and her view of grounds maintained by men with guns came from anything other than suffering. Marco pretended he had a choice, that the meetings his father dragged him to were optional, that the future being arranged for him was one he could still escape, and Grace pretended she was just the help, just the invisible woman who kept their world running while they looked right through her. But pretenses, like everything else, have a shelf life. And theirs was about to expire. The Caruso family had controlled the Eastern Territories for 3 generations, an arrangement that had held through wars both foreign and domestic, through arrests and acquittals, through the natural cycle of violence that governed their world, like gravity governed the planets. The old Caruso patriarch, Salvatore, had been a man who understood balance. He took his share and no more, resolved disputes with conversation before bullets, and maintained a network of alliances that made open conflict disadvantageous for everyone involved. When he died, peacefully in his sleep at 84, people on both sides of the divide had mourned genuinely. But Dominic Caruso was not his father, and he was certainly not his grandfather. He was 34 years old, educated at schools that taught him to want things his heritage couldn't provide, and he was tired of waiting for what he considered his birthright. He looked at the old arrangements and saw weakness, old men clinging to outdated agreements while younger, hungrier competitors circled like sharks. He looked at Vincent Mancini's attempts to go legitimate and saw opportunity, a rival distracted by respectability, soft from years of peace, ripe for the taking. The first real sign of trouble came on a Thursday, disguised as a delivery van that lingered too long at the end of the drive. Grace noticed it from the kitchen window while she was washing the breakfast dishes, noticed how the driver never left the vehicle, how the van's windows were tinted just dark enough to obscure what was inside, how it sat there for exactly 47 minutes before pulling away without making any delivery. She made a note of the license plate, a habit so ingrained she didn't realize she was doing it until the numbers were already committed to memory. The van came back the next day, and the day after that. Different times, different positions along the perimeter, but always the same pattern: arrive, observe, leave, classic reconnaissance. Amateur hour, really. Anyone with basic training would have varied their approach more, but effective enough if no one was watching. And no one was watching, except Grace. Vincent's meetings grew longer, louder, and more frequent. Men arrived at odd hours, their faces tight with the particular tension of people who were used to being in control and suddenly weren't. They brought files and laptops and worried expressions, spoke in half sentences that stopped whenever Grace entered a room, and left looking even more worried than when they'd arrived. The security team doubled their patrols, then tripled them. New cameras appeared on the corners of the house, their red lights blinking like anxious eyes. Grace served coffee and collected intelligence, building a picture from scraps of conversation and careful observation. The Carusos were making moves, aggressive moves, the kind that broke 3 generations of precedent. Territories were being contested. Shipments were going missing. Men who had worked for the Mancinis for years were switching allegiances or disappearing entirely. Lines that had stood for decades were being erased and redrawn in blood. "They think we're weak," she heard Vincent say one evening, his voice carrying through the study door she was careful to keep slightly ajar. "They think because I've tried to do things differently, because I've moved us toward legitimate operations, because I've stopped putting bodies in the ground every time someone looks at us wrong. They think they can just take what's ours." Another voice, one of the advisors, a man named Russo, whose suits never quite fit right. "Dominic's not thinking long term. He wants to make a statement, prove he's not his grandfather." "Then we'll give him a statement." Grace moved away from the door, her face betraying nothing. She had heard threats like this before, in briefing rooms and forward operating bases, in the quiet moments before everything went loud. She recognized the tone, the particular mixture of anger and fear that preceded violence, the point where negotiation ended and consequences began, the point of no return that everyone could see coming, but no one could stop. Elena's decline accelerated in ways that couldn't be hidden anymore. She stopped coming down for meals, stopped pretending to tend her garden, stopped everything except the pills and the long stares out her bedroom window. The pretense of normality she'd maintained for years simply collapsed, like a building whose foundation had finally given way. Grace brought her trays that came back untouched, made her bed around a body that barely seemed to occupy it, and witnessed a woman slowly disappearing into the comfortable prison of her own making. "You don't have to stay," Elena said one afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper. The bedroom was dark despite the afternoon sun outside. She'd asked Grace to close the curtains weeks ago and hadn't asked for them to be opened since. "In this house, I mean, with all of this." Grace smoothed the bed sheets, a task that didn't need doing, but gave her hands something to do. "Neither do you, ma'am." Elena laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "You don't understand. You can't understand." But Grace understood better than Elena could have imagined. She understood the weight of knowing too much, the paralysis of being complicit in things that corroded the soul. She understood the particular exhaustion of living inside a lie, so large it had become indistinguishable from the architecture around you. She understood that some cages didn't have visible bars, and that sometimes the person holding the key was too afraid to use it. Marco began shadowing his father, appearing at meetings he'd previously avoided, his face growing harder by the day. Grace watched him learning to become the thing he'd always feared, watched the softness leave his eyes, watched his posture change from uncertain to rigid, watched him practice the expressions that would one day come naturally. It was like watching someone drown in slow motion, the water rising so gradually that by the time they realized they couldn't breathe, it was already too late. "I used to want to be a teacher," he told her one night, another of their strange kitchen confessions. The clock on the wall read 2:47 a.m., and the only light came from the under-cabinet fixtures that Grace always left on for moments exactly like this. History. Can you imagine? Me, standing in front of a classroom, talking about things that happened 100 years ago like they mattered. They do matter. Not here, not in this family. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Here, the only history that matters is the one you're making, and the one that's coming for you. The security around the estate doubled, then tripled. New faces appeared, harder faces, men who didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were. They walked the perimeter with automatic weapons barely concealed under their jackets, spoke into radios with coded phrases, and looked at Grace with the particular suspicion of people trained to see everyone as a potential threat. She cataloged them all, noting their weapons, their positions, their patterns. Old habits, she told herself. Old habits that might serve new purposes. She began keeping a bag packed, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room. Inside, cash. $3,000 in small bills, a change of clothes, documents that could get her somewhere else, someone else. A burner phone with 3 numbers programmed in, all belonging to people who owed her favors from another life. But she didn't leave. Part of it was practical. Where would she go that her past wouldn't eventually follow? Part of it was something else, something she was reluctant to name. These people had seen through her for 9 years, had treated her like furniture with a pulse, had never once considered that she might be more than what she appeared. And yet she had fed them, cleaned up after them, witnessed their grief and their cruelty and their strange, stunted attempts at love. She had watched Marco grow from a boy into a man being broken by circumstances he hadn't chosen. She had watched Elena fade from a person into a ghost who still drew breath. She had watched even Vincent in his unguarded moments reveal flickers of something that might have been humanity if it hadn't been buried so deep. They were not good people, but they were, in some twisted way, her people. People don't change. They just run out of room to pretend. And in this house, the rooms were getting smaller by the day. The call came at 3 a.m, 2 weeks after the delivery van first appeared. Grace heard Vincent's phone ring through the wall, heard his muffled curse, heard the tone of his voice change from anger to something colder, more controlled. By the time she dressed and made her way to the main house, the lights were on in every room, and men with guns were moving through the hallways like ghosts with purpose. "Stay in your quarters," one of them told her, not unkindly. His name was Torres, and he was one of the few who occasionally said please and thank you when she served him coffee. Things are about to get complicated. Grace nodded, the picture of compliance. She went back to her room, retrieved her weapon from beneath the floorboard, and took up a position by the window that gave her a clear view of the main entrance. Complicated. She'd seen complicated. Complicated was Fallujah in 2004, clearing buildings room by room while insurgents set up ambushes behind every door. Complicated was a safe house in Karachi that stopped being safe. 3 of her team dead in the first 30 seconds, the rest fighting their way out through streets that had become a shooting gallery. This wasn't complicated yet, but it would be, soon. They came 3 nights later, and they came wrong. Grace heard the breach before anyone else did, a sound that didn't belong, the particular quality of silence that meant someone was trying too hard to be quiet. It was a sound most people wouldn't notice, like the absence of crickets before a storm, but Grace had spent 20 years training herself to hear exactly this. She was already moving before the first shots cracked the night open, her body remembering things her mind had tried to forget. The Caruso assault team had done their homework, but not enough of it. They'd mapped the security positions, identified the patrol routes, even managed to disable the exterior cameras with a focused EMP burst that was actually fairly impressive for a criminal organization. What they hadn't accounted for was the woman in the servants' quarters with 20 years of special operations training and a very particular set of skills. Grace counted 8 entry points based on the sound signature, 2 teams of 4, 1 coming through the east wing, 1 through the garage. Standard pincer movement, the kind they taught in tactical school before they taught you all the ways it could go wrong. The Mancini security was responding, but slowly, too slowly. They'd gotten comfortable, these men in their expensive suits with their expensive weapons. They'd forgotten what it meant to face someone who actually wanted them dead. She moved through the house like smoke, using the servant passages she'd mapped over 9 years of being invisible. These were the arteries of the estate that no one thought about. Narrow hallways behind walls, service stairs connecting floors, doors that looked like closets but led to other doors. She knew every inch of them, had used them thousands of times to appear exactly where she was needed, without anyone noticing how she got there. Now she used them for a different purpose. The first Caruso man she encountered didn't even know she was there until she'd already taken his weapon and put him on the ground with a modified chokehold that would keep him quiet for exactly 4 minutes. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of face that probably had a mother somewhere worrying about him. Grace secured his hands with his own belt and kept moving. She didn't have time for guilt. That would come later, if she survived. The second one saw her coming. His mistake was assuming that what he saw, a middle-aged black woman in a housekeeper's uniform, was all there was. He hesitated for exactly half a second, his brain trying to reconcile the image with the threat. The cognitive dissonance of it, the sheer impossibility of this woman being dangerous, bought her the time she needed. That half-second cost him consciousness and 2 teeth. She zip-tied his wrists to a radiator and moved on. The sounds of the firefight grew louder as she approached the main house. Gunfire in enclosed spaces has a particular quality, sharp and flat at the same time, echoing off walls until it seems to come from everywhere at once. Grace had learned to read it like a language, parsing the different calibers, the rates of fire, the patterns that told her who was winning and who was losing. Right now, it sounded like chaos. Right now, it sounded like the Mancinis were losing. She found Marco in the study, pressed against the wall behind his father's desk, his hands shaking around a pistol he clearly didn't know how to use. His finger was on the trigger, which was wrong. You kept your finger along the frame until you were ready to fire, and his grip was too tight, which would throw off his aim even if he managed to point it at the right person. 2 of Vincent's men were down, bleeding, on the carpet that Grace had vacuumed just yesterday. A third was exchanging fire with someone in the hallway, the sound impossibly loud in the enclosed space. "Grace?" Marco's voice cracked. How did you?" "Stay down," she said, her voice carrying the particular calm of someone who had been in worse situations and survived them. It was the voice she'd used in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in places she couldn't name, the voice that told people she knew what she was doing, that following her instructions was their best chance of seeing tomorrow. "Stay quiet. Don't shoot unless you're sure of your target." She didn't wait for his response. The Caruso shooter in the hallway had the advantage of cover, but the disadvantage of not knowing the house. Grace did. She moved through the connecting bathroom, the one Elena used when she couldn't face walking all the way to her own suite, came out behind him, and ended the engagement with an efficiency that would have impressed her old commanding officers. A strike to the throat, a knee to the back of his leg, and a chokehold that put him down in 7 seconds. She took his weapon and kept moving. The next 20 minutes existed outside of normal time, the way combat always did. Grace moved through the house, clearing threats with a precision that left no room for thought, only action. Her body knew what to do, even when her mind was still catching up. Muscle memory from thousands of hours of training, from dozens of operations where hesitation meant death. She found Elena in her bedroom, mercifully untouched, frozen in shock against the headboard. She found Vincent in the basement, wounded but alive, surrounded by 3 of his remaining men and a level of chaos that spoke to just how close the Carusos had come to succeeding. "The Maid?" one of Vincent's men said, his voice incredulous. He was bleeding from a wound on his arm, holding it like he wasn't sure what to do with it. "The fucking Maid?" Grace ignored him. "How many more outside?" Vincent stared at her, bleeding from a wound in his shoulder, his carefully maintained composure finally cracked. For the first time in 9 years, he was looking at her. Really looking, not through her, not past her, but at her. "Who are you?" "Someone who's trying to keep you alive." "How many more outside?" "We don't know. The cameras are down. Could be 2, could be 10. Grace assessed the situation with practiced eyes. Wounded boss, depleted security, unknown enemy strength, multiple civilians to protect. She'd had worse odds. Not often, but she'd had them. "I need everyone mobile in the panic room, now." "We don't take orders from the help," one of the men started, but Vincent cut him off with a look that would have frozen lava. "Do what she says." The panic room was in the basement sublevel, a concrete box designed to withstand anything short of a direct military assault. Grace had known about it since her 2nd year with the family. You couldn't clean a house this thoroughly without finding its secrets. The door was reinforced steel, the walls were 2 feet of poured concrete, and the communications equipment inside could reach anyone in the world. She shepherded the family inside, checked the supplies, verified the landline, and prepared to do something she'd promised herself she'd never do again. "Lock it behind me," she told Marco, pressing the keypad code into his hands. "Don't open it for anyone except me. Anyone. Not your father's men, not the police, not anyone claiming to be on your side. Only me." "Where are you going?" "To finish this." She told herself it was love, but love doesn't make you feel this small. The old Grace, the one who had believed in missions and country and the clear moral lines that separated good from bad, that Grace was long dead, buried under years of seeing how complicated the world really was. The Grace who moved through that house, hunting men who had come to kill a family of criminals, didn't know what she was anymore. She only knew that these people, for all their sins, didn't deserve to die tonight. Not like this. Not by these particular hands. The remaining Caruso team, 4 men, she confirmed, had regrouped near the east wing, likely trying to figure out what had gone wrong with their carefully planned assault. Grace watched them from the shadows of a doorway, reading their body language, their frustration, their growing fear. They'd expected guards and maybe some resistance. They'd expected professional security doing a professional job. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected someone like her. She gave them a choice, though they didn't know it. She could have ended them all from where she stood, silent and surgical. She had a clear line of fire on 3 of them, and the 4th would be easy to take once the others were down. Part of her wanted to. Part of her remembered every operation where leaving someone alive had come back to haunt her. Every enemy combatant who'd returned to kill more of her people because she'd been soft. But that Grace was supposed to be dead too. Instead, she let them see her. Just a glimpse. Just enough to make them follow. She led them away from the house, away from the family, into the vast darkness of the estate's grounds, where the advantages shifted entirely in her favor. The Mancini property had 17 acres of manicured gardens, decorative woods, and carefully maintained paths that Grace had walked 1,000 times in 9 years. She knew every tree, every shadow, every blind spot. The men following her knew none of it. One by one, they fell. Not dead. She hadn't killed anyone tonight, a distinction she clung to with something like hope. But out of the fight, their weapons secured, their communications destroyed. She used the darkness and their own fear against them, striking from angles they couldn't predict, disappearing before they could respond. By the time that police finally arrived, called by neighbors who'd heard the initial gunfire and taken their time deciding whether to get involved, the threat was neutralized and Grace Mitchell was back in her room above the garage, her weapon cleaned and hidden, her uniform exchanged for a simple nightgown. Just the maid, just the help, just another invisible woman who'd slept through the whole terrible thing. The detective who interviewed her the next morning was thorough but unimaginative, a career cop who'd learned to see what he expected to see and nothing more. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, notepad open, pen poised, and asked her where she'd been when the shooting started. "In my room, sir, above the garage." Grace kept her voice steady, her eyes appropriately wide. "I heard the gunshots and I was too scared to move. I just stayed under my bed until it was quiet." "You didn't see anything? Hear anything specific?" "Just the noise. It was so loud. I thought—" She let her voice catch, let a tremor run through her hands. "I thought they were coming for me too." The detective nodded, satisfied. He saw what everyone saw, a frightened older woman, a domestic servant caught up in something far beyond her understanding, a witness who had nothing useful to offer. He closed his notepad, thanked her for her time, and moved on to interview the security guards who'd actually engaged the intruders, the ones who could tell him about tactical approaches and weapon types, and all the details that mattered to men who measured violence in calibers and casualty counts. Grace made him coffee before he left. She always made coffee. It was what she did. Later that afternoon, while the forensics team was still processing the scene, she walked through the house conducting her own assessment. The damage was significant but not catastrophic. Structural repairs would take weeks. Emotional repairs would take longer. She counted the bullet holes in the walls, noted the blood stains that would need special treatment, calculated the hours of work ahead of her. The routine of it calmed her, the familiarity of seeing a space that needed to be cleaned and knowing exactly how to clean it. In the study, she found Marco's pistol still where he'd dropped it, wedged between the desk and the wall. The police had missed it in their sweep. They'd been focused on the bodies, the shell casings, the obvious evidence of violence. Grace picked it up, checked the chamber, and tucked it into her waistband. She'd return it to Vincent later, or dispose of it, depending on how the next few days unfolded. The house felt different now, even in the daylight. The attack had stripped away some essential pretense, revealed the scaffolding beneath the surface. This was not a home. It never had been. It was a fortress, a monument, a stage where a particular kind of performance had been running for decades, and Grace had just rewritten the script in ways none of them had anticipated. She wondered if they would ask her to leave. She wondered if she would go if they did. She wondered a lot of things, standing there in the ruined study with a dead man's weapon against her hip and 9 years of accumulated knowledge heavy in her chest. But wondering was a luxury she'd never been able to afford for long. There was work to do. There was always work to do. The aftermath unfolded in stages, each revelation landing with the weight of something that had been waiting to fall. The police came and went, satisfied with the story Vincent's lawyers constructed. A robbery gone wrong, loyal security guards who'd given their lives to protect the family, no leads worth pursuing. It was the kind of story that only held together if you didn't look too closely. But money had a way of ensuring no one looked too closely at anything the Mancinis didn't want examined. The bodies were removed, the carpets replaced, the walls repainted. Within a week, the house looked exactly as it had before, the violence erased with the same efficiency that had always characterized the Mancini approach to problems. Contractors came and went, speaking in hushed tones about water damage and renovations, their invoices carefully documenting work that had nothing to do with what had actually happened. The new security cameras went up. The new guards took their positions. Life, or something that passed for it, resumed. But some things couldn't be painted over. Vincent summoned Grace to his study on the third day after the attack, the first time he'd ever requested her presence rather than simply expecting it. She stood before his desk, hands folded, face neutral, every inch the servant waiting for instructions. But they both knew the performance had changed, the script rewritten by events neither of them had anticipated. "I've made inquiries," he said, his wounded arm held stiffly at his side. The doctors had wanted to keep him in the hospital, but Vincent Mancini didn't stay anywhere he couldn't control. "About you. I assumed you would. Fort Bragg, Delta Force, 14 years of service, most of it classified. 3 deployments to places that don't officially exist. Decorations you can't display because the missions you earned them on never happened." He paused, watching her face for a reaction he wasn't going to get. "Honorable discharge in 2015, then nothing. You disappeared. I wanted to disappear. Why here? Why us?" Grace considered the question, considered the many answers she could give, some true, some convenient, most somewhere in between. "Because nobody looks at the help, because a black woman my age, doing this kind of work, is exactly invisible enough to stop existing. Because I was tired of being seen." Vincent leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that felt like being weighed on some internal scale. "You could have let us die, walked away. No one would have known. I would have known. That matters to you? After everything you've done? It's the only thing that matters anymore." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to voice. Finally, Vincent nodded, something shifting in his expression. Not quite respect, not quite understanding, but something adjacent to both. "The Caruzas will regroup. What happened here? It's not over. It's barely begun. I know. I'm offering you a position, a real position. Head of household security. Salary commensurate with your actual skills. No more pretending." Grace felt the offer settle over her like a shroud. This was the moment, the fork in the road she'd always known was coming. She could step fully into this world, use her skills to protect people who trafficked in pain, become complicit in ways that couldn't be rationalized away. Or she could walk away, disappear again, find another house in another city where another family would look right through her. "No," she said. Vincent's face hardened. "No? I didn't save your family so I could help you destroy someone else's. I saved them because they were in front of me, because I could, because that's who I decided to be when I stopped being everything else." She met his eyes, steady and unafraid. "I'll stay until this is settled, until the Caruso threat is contained. I'll help you protect your family. But I won't help you build an army, and I won't be part of whatever comes next." "You think you get to make demands?" "I think I just saved your life, Mr. Mancini. I think I saved your son and your wife and everyone in this house. I think that buys me the right to set my own terms." The standoff lasted exactly 7 seconds. She counted, an old habit, before Vincent laughed. It was a strange sound, genuine in a way she'd never heard from him. "My father would have had you killed for talking to him like that. Your father isn't here. No, he isn't." Vincent reached into his desk and withdrew an envelope. "Your terms are acceptable. This is your first month's consulting fee. The rest we can negotiate when things are calmer." Grace took the envelope without looking inside. Money had never been the point. The confrontation with Dominic Caruso came 2 weeks later, orchestrated by Grace with the same precision she'd once applied to sanctioned operations. She arranged the meeting on neutral ground, a restaurant in the city, public enough to discourage violence, private enough for honest conversation. Vincent didn't know about it until it was already happening. A calculated risk that could have ended her new arrangement as quickly as it had begun. Dominic was younger than she'd expected, angrier than was useful, and smarter than anyone gave him credit for. He had the look of a man who'd spent his whole life being underestimated and had learned to use it as a weapon. She sat across from him in a back booth, 2 cups of coffee growing cold between them, and laid out what she knew. Not about the Mancinis. She wasn't here to betray anyone, but about him, his operations, his weaknesses, the places where his ambition had outpaced his resources. "You're the Maid," he said, somewhere between amused and incredulous. "The one who took out 8 of my men. I'm someone who's trying to end this before more people die. By hurting mine. None of your men died that night, Mr. Caruso. Check with your hospitals. Broken bones, concussions, wounded pride. But everyone went home alive. I could have done it differently." She saw him processing this, recalculating. Whatever intelligence he'd gathered about the attack, it hadn't included that detail. "What do you want?" "Peace. Or at least the absence of war. The old arrangements weren't perfect, but they worked. People on both sides built lives, had families, made plans that didn't include dying in someone else's hallway." "You sound like my grandfather." "Your grandfather was a smart man." The conversation lasted 3 hours. She didn't convince him. Men like Dominic weren't convinced. They were maneuvered. But she planted seeds. Doubt about whether the Mancinis were as weak as he'd assumed. Practical concerns about the cost of continued conflict. The suggestion, never quite spoken aloud, that his own people might not follow him into a war that had already proven more costly than expected. He never saw it coming, not because it was sudden, but because it was patient. That was the thing about real change. It didn't announce itself with explosions and drama. It crept in through conversations, through recalculations, through the slow erosion of certainty, until what had seemed inevitable suddenly wasn't. 2 months later, the ceasefire was formalized. Not peace. That was too much to ask from men like these, but something workable, something that would hold long enough for the wounds to scab over. Grace watched from her familiar position in the shadows as Vincent and Dominic shook hands, both of them pretending it was their idea, both of them knowing exactly whose idea it really was. A year passed. The seasons turned, the gardens bloomed and withered and bloomed again, and the Mancini estate settled back into its rhythms of expensive silence. Grace remained, though her role had shifted in ways that defied easy description. She still cleaned, still served, still maintained the fiction of being the help, but everyone knew now. Everyone had heard the story, embellished and distorted through countless retellings, of the night the Maid became something else. Elena was the first to change how she treated Grace. It started small, a thank you here, a please there, the basic courtesies that had always been missing. Then longer conversations, questions about Grace's life before this house, a genuine interest that seemed to cost Elena something to express. She stopped taking quite so many pills, started spending time in her garden again, started, in her own fragile way, to come back to life. "I never asked," Elena said one afternoon, both of them on their knees in the dirt, planting bulbs that wouldn't bloom until spring. "What it was like, your life before." "No one did. I'm asking now." Grace considered the question, the soil cool and rich between her fingers. "It was necessary. The things I did, the places I went, they were necessary at the time. But necessary and good aren't always the same thing. Are they ever? Sometimes, if you're lucky, if you choose right." Elena nodded, understanding something that didn't need more words. They worked in companionable silence until the sun began to set. 2 women who had both survived things that should have destroyed them, finding in the simple act of planting something a kind of hope neither had expected. Marco left. It happened gradually, then all at once. First the conversations with his father that ended in doors slamming, then the packed bags that disappeared and reappeared, then the final morning, when he came to Grace's quarters with an envelope and eyes that were finally, fully his own. "I got accepted," he said. "Teaching program, history if you can believe it. I can believe it. My father thinks I'm abandoning the family." "Your father thinks a lot of things. Not all of them are true." He pressed the envelope into her hands. Money, she assumed, some gesture of gratitude that he didn't know how else to express. "You showed me something, that night and after. That you could be one thing and then choose to be something else. That the past doesn't have to own you. It doesn't, but it stays with you, good and bad. I know." He hugged her then, awkward and brief and entirely unexpected. "Thank you for everything you didn't have to do." She watched him drive away, his car growing smaller until it disappeared beyond the iron gates. She didn't cry. She'd lost the ability somewhere along the way, but she felt something shift in her chest, something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been loss, or might have been both at once. Vincent never quite knew what to do with her after that. He'd offered her power, and she'd refused it. He'd offered her money, and she'd taken only what she needed. She remained a constant presence in his house, a reminder of the night his carefully constructed world had cracked open and revealed something unexpected at its center. Sometimes she caught him watching her, trying to figure out the equation, trying to understand why someone would choose to be invisible when they could have been seen. He never asked directly. She never explained. The truth was simpler than he imagined and more complicated than she could articulate. She stayed because leaving would have meant starting over, and she was tired of starting over. She stayed because this family, for all its darkness, had become familiar in a way that felt like home. She stayed because Marco had needed to see that escape was possible, and Elena had needed to remember she wasn't alone. And, even Vincent, in his corrupt and violent way, had needed to know that loyalty could exist without leverage. She stayed because the invisible woman had finally been seen, and it hadn't destroyed her. The first anniversary approached like weather, something you could feel coming even before you could name it. Grace found herself thinking about time differently now, measuring it not in days or weeks, but in seasons of change. The garden cycle, the rhythm of the house, the gradual softening of expressions that had once looked right through her. She thought often about the men she'd fought that night, wondered where they were now, whether they'd recovered from their injuries, whether they ever thought about the woman who'd appeared out of nowhere and dismantled everything they'd trained for. She'd looked some of them up, using skills and contacts from her previous life, and discovered that most had left the Caruso organization entirely. The failed assault had broken something in them, or maybe it had freed them. Sometimes those were the same thing. The one she thought about most was the youngest, the first one she'd taken down, barely more than a boy with a face his mother probably still worried about. His name was Anthony Russo, no relation to Vincent's advisor, and he was 24 years old. She'd found out he was working construction now, honest work that would never make him rich but would also never make him a target. She thought about sending him something, a note, an apology, some acknowledgement of the violence she'd done to him, but she never did. Some debts couldn't be paid with words. The house itself seemed to breathe differently now. The new security measures were extensive but unobtrusive, designed by a consultant Grace had recommended, someone from her old life who owed her enough favors to do excellent work at reasonable rates. Cameras covered every approach, motion sensors lined the perimeter, and the panic room had been upgraded with supplies that could sustain the family for weeks if necessary. Vincent had spent the money without complaint, which was perhaps the clearest indicator of how deeply the attack had shaken him. But it wasn't the security that had really changed. It was something subtler, harder to name. The quality of silence in the rooms, the way people moved through spaces, the small courtesies that had begun appearing like flowers pushing through concrete. Please and thank you. Eye contact held a moment longer than before. Acknowledgement where there had only been assumption. Grace noticed all of it. She'd spent her whole life noticing things other people missed. It was what had kept her alive through 2 decades of service and 9 years of invisibility. But noticing something and understanding it were different skills, and she wasn't sure she understood what was happening in this house. She only knew that it felt like something was ending, or maybe something was beginning, or maybe, and this was the thought that surprised her most, maybe it was both at the same time. On the anniversary of the attack, Grace walked the grounds at dawn, following a route that had become ritual. She paused at the east wing, where the bullet holes had been patched and painted. She paused at the service entrance, where she'd first walked in 9 years ago. She paused at the garage, where her bag remained packed beneath the loose floorboard, a contingency she no longer expected to need, but couldn't quite bring herself to dismantle. The gardens were starting to wake up, the bulbs she and Elena had planted pushing green shoots through the dark earth. In a few weeks, there would be color here, life asserting itself against the memory of violence, beauty emerging from soil that had soaked up blood. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want justice. She didn't want any of the things people usually wanted when they'd done what she'd done, survived what she'd survived. She wanted exactly what she had, a place to stand, people to protect, the chance to be more than her past, while never pretending it hadn't happened. By the time she returned to the house, the coffee was ready, the newspapers laid out, the flowers checked for wilting. She moved through her tasks with the same precision she'd always brought to them, the same careful attention to detail that had once kept soldiers alive in places she still couldn't name. The work was different, but the discipline was the same. The purpose had changed, but the commitment hadn't. Even silence has a sound if you've lost enough. Grace had lost more than most: a career, a country's trust, a version of herself that had believed in clear moral lines. But she'd found something too, in this improbable place with these improbable people. She'd found proof that change was possible, that the story you'd been living didn't have to be the story you died in. Some endings arrived dressed as forgiveness. This one looked like a woman making coffee in the early morning light, invisible by choice now rather than circumstance, carrying knowledge of violence in hands that tended flowers and served meals, and, when necessary, protected the people who had finally learned to see her. By dawn, the city forgot. The newspapers had moved on to other tragedies, other scandals, other stories of power and its consequences. But Grace didn't forget. She remembered every moment, every choice, every life she'd spared, and every truth she'd revealed. That was how survival sounded. Quiet, deliberate, present, and that was enough. It had to be. She didn't want revenge. She wanted peace. Revenge just got her there faster.